I stood alone in the Seattle Superior Court while camera flashes erupted like lightning storms behind the glass. My parents sat across from me, grinning next to their shark of a lawyer, claiming my clean energy empire worth millions of dollars actually belonged to them. They had kicked me out 10 years ago, with nothing but now wanted to ruin me. They thought they had won until the judge asked one question that destroyed their entire scheme. My name is Elena Vance, and for the last 5 years, I have been the face of the new energy revolution, standing on the center stage of the Seattle Global Innovation Summit. I felt the familiar heat of the spotlight and the heavy silence of 3,000 people holding their breath. I was the CEO of Novus Energy, and I was holding the future in the palm of my hand. The device was the size of a deck of cards, a matte black block that represented the first commercially viable perpetual energy battery. I looked down at the documents in my hands, my fingers trembling slightly, despite my best efforts to remain stone-faced. The names on the plaintiff line hit me harder than a physical blow. Roger Vance and Mary Vance. My parents. The people who had told me I was worthless and kicked me out into the snow 10 years ago were now back. I scanned the summary of the complaint, and bile rose in my throat. They were not just asking for money. They were demanding 80% of Novus Energy. They claimed that the seed money for my company and the very concept of the battery technology had been stolen from family funds and my father's intellectual property. It was a lie so bold and grotesque that I almost laughed, but the lens of the cameras kept me frozen. While I was being ushered off the stage by my panicked public relations team, the real damage was already being done in the lobby. A lawyer named Silas Blackwood had set up an impromptu press conference. I watched the feed on a tablet backstage. Blackwood was a shark with a polished veneer, looking straight into the news cameras with practiced solemnity. He told the world that I was a predator who had abandoned my elderly, suffering parents after stealing their life savings to build my empire. He spun a narrative of a heartless daughter living in luxury while her creators starved. It was the kind of story the public loved to hate. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. By the time the markets closed that afternoon, Novus Energy stock had plummeted 30%. My phone was a brick of constant notifications as board members screamed for answers and major investors suspended their funding rounds. The empire I had built with blood and sleepless nights was cracking foundationally in a matter of hours. I retreated to my penthouse that evening, a glass sanctuary overlooking the gray, rain-swept skyline of Seattle. Usually, this view gave me a sense of peace, a reminder of how far I had climbed from the dirt-poor town in Ohio. Now, the apartment felt cold and sterile. I poured a glass of whiskey but did not drink it. I just stared at the rain, feeling the old, jagged wound of abandonment tear open again. They did not just want my money. They wanted to destroy me because I had succeeded without them. My phone buzzed on the marble countertop. It was Sarah Jenkins, my general counsel and the only person I trusted. Her voice was tight with panic. She told me that the judge had granted an emergency injunction, based on the evidence my parents had provided, which Sarah described as terrifyingly sophisticated forgeries. The court had ordered a temporary freeze on all my assets, my personal accounts, my stock options, and even my access to company operational funds were locked. I stood there in the dark, the richest woman in the room, realizing I did not even have access to enough cash to buy a cup of coffee. The trap had snapped shut. The silence of the penthouse was heavy, pressing against my ears until it sounded like the wind howling through the cracks of my childhood home in Ohio. 12 years had passed since I last stood in that house, but looking at the rain streaking the glass, I was suddenly back in that cramped kitchen with the peeling yellow wallpaper. It was a place where dreams went to die, suffocated by the smell of stale cigarette smoke and resentment. My parents, Roger and Mary, had always operated on a simple, brutal logic. In their world, I was a resource to be used, while my younger brother Lucas was a treasure to be protected. Lucas was lazy, drifting through life with a sense of entitlement that my parents fed with every excuse they made for him. He had found my advanced calculus and physics textbooks, books I had bought with money skimmed from my lunch budget. He threw them into the fireplace, watching the pages curl and blacken with a grim satisfaction. They did not hit me that night. They did something worse. They sat me down and dismantled me with words. My mother told me I was selfish for thinking I could leave them. She asked who would help pay the bills when Lucas needed a car or when the store had a bad month. They called me useless, arrogant, and a traitor to the blood in my veins. They stripped away every accomplishment I had ever earned, reducing me to nothing more than an ungrateful servant who had forgotten her place. I left an hour later. I packed a single backpack with 2 changes of clothes and the few dollars I had hidden in a hollowed-out book. It was snowing, a thick white curtain that erased the road, but I did not care. As I opened the front door, my father did not try to stop me. He simply told me that if I walked out that door, I was dead to them. He said I would fail, and when I did, I was forbidden from coming back to beg for food. I stepped into the cold, letting the wind bite my skin, and I did not look back. The first year in Boston was a blur of exhaustion that still made my bones ache when I thought about it. I worked 3 jobs, scrubbing floors in a diner at dawn and shelving books at night, just to afford food. I had no apartment. For 4 months, I slept on a worn leather sofa in the basement of the university library, waking up before the janitors arrived to wash my face in the public bathroom. I was always hungry and always tired, but I was free. Every equation I solved and every line of code I wrote was an act of defiance. I turned away from the window and looked at my reflection in the mirror of the hallway. The expensive makeup was washed away, and the designer clothes were replaced by a simple robe. But beneath the layers of wealth and status, I saw her again. I saw the girl who had walked through a blizzard with nothing but rage and hope to keep her warm. My parents thought they could break me by taking away my money, but they had forgotten who I was. I had started with nothing, and I knew how to survive on nothing. This lawsuit was not about 80% of my company or justice. It was revenge. They hated that I had climbed out of the pit they dug for me, and they wanted to drag me back down into the mud with them. I tightened the sash of my robe and stared into my own eyes. They would not win. The reality of the injunction hit me the next morning like a physical weight. I sat in my office staring at the corporate banking portal. The status read, "Frozen" in bright red letters. Next Tuesday was the first of the month, which meant payroll for 200 employees was due. These were people with mortgages and families who believed in me, and I had absolutely no way to pay them. To make matters worse, Fossil Corp had smelled blood in the water. Within 48 hours of the lawsuit going public, they launched a massive ad campaign questioning the stability of startup energy firms. They did not name Novus directly, but the implication was clear. They were strangling my company while my parents held me down. I had to stop the bleeding. I spent the afternoon liquidating everything I owned that was not nailed down. I sold my vintage sports car for cash to a collector at a fraction of its value. I pawned my diamond earrings and the luxury watches I had bought to celebrate milestones. Every dollar went into a separate, unblocked escrow account just to keep the server costs paid and the lights on at headquarters. My lawyer, Sarah, was digging into the opposition. She discovered that Silas Blackwood was not just a family lawyer. He was a specialist in what people called legal extortion. His entire career was built on representing estranged family members of celebrities and lottery winners, filing frivolous suits to force settlements. He knew I would pay to make this go away, but he underestimated how stubborn I was. I needed leverage, so I reached out to the one weak link in their chain. I met my brother, Lucas, in a dim diner on the outskirts of the city. He looked terrible. His skin was gray, and his hands shook as he held his coffee cup. It did not take long for the truth to spill out. Lucas was in deep with loan sharks. He owed over $200,000 to people who broke kneecaps for a living. He admitted that Mom and Dad did not care about the company. They were suing me because they had promised to use the settlement money to clear his debt. I begged him to testify. I told him he could end this nightmare by telling the judge the truth. Lucas just looked down at the table and refused. He was terrified that if he crossed our parents, they would cut him off completely, and without their protection, the loan sharks would kill him. He walked out of the diner, leaving me with the check and the bitter realization that my entire life was being torched to cover his gambling losses. The final blow of the week came on Friday evening. My landlord served me with an eviction notice for the penthouse. The lease had a morality clause regarding criminal investigations and financial instability, and the board wanted me out. I packed 2 suitcases, leaving behind the custom furniture and the art, and checked into a roadside motel 10 miles outside the city limits. The room smelled of mildew and old cigarettes. I sat on the lumpy mattress and turned on the small television. The local news was playing an exclusive interview. My mother was on the screen, wiping away fake tears with a handkerchief. She wailed about how they had starved so I could eat and how I had discarded them like trash. It was a masterclass in manipulation. I turned off the TV and sat in the dark, listening to the sirens outside, stripped of my home, my money, and my reputation. But in that darkness, my resolve only hardened. I had nothing left to lose, which meant I was finally dangerous. Sarah Jenkins transformed her conference room into a forensic lab, covering the mahogany table with stacks of financial records that spanned over a decade. The air in the room was thick with the smell of cold coffee and the tension of a ticking clock. We had 48 hours before the next hearing, and we needed to deconstruct the fabrication my parents had built. We started with the physical evidence they had submitted to the court to justify the asset freeze. It consisted of 2 main exhibits. The first was a handwritten ledger that my mother had allegedly kept. It was a spiral notebook where she had meticulously recorded every expense she claimed to have spent on me, categorizing them as a loan. She had charged me for room, board, and electricity starting from my 16th birthday. It was petty and cruel, but not illegal. However, the second piece of evidence was the smoking gun. It was a grainy photocopy of a wire transfer receipt. The document appeared to show a transaction of $50,000 sent from my father's account to a bank in Boston, dated 3 days after I left home. The memo line read, Seed Capital. I stared at the piece of paper, my hands clenching into fists. I told Sarah that this was impossible. When I arrived in Boston, I did not even have a bank account. I had $7 in my pocket and a bus ticket. I survived on bagels and tap water. If I had possessed $50,000, I would not have been sleeping in a library basement. The receipt was a forgery, likely created using a template from a different transaction and altered to fit their narrative. But it was a good forgery. Without the original digital trail to disprove it, the judge had to treat it as potential evidence. While I fumed over the documents, Sarah took a different angle. She had hired a private investigator to look into Silas Blackwood. She found it suspicious that a high-profile corporate shark was representing a couple of retired grocers from Ohio. The math did not add up. Blackwood charged $600 an hour, and my parents claimed to be destitute. The investigator returned with a report that confirmed our darkest suspicions. My parents were not paying Blackwood. His retainer was being funded by a blind trust managed by a shell company in Delaware. Sarah dug deeper, tracing the corporate officers of that shell company. It took hours of cross-referencing, but she finally found a link. The trust was indirectly controlled by a subsidiary of Fossil Corp. The realization hit me cold. My parents were merely puppets. Fossil Corp was funding this lawsuit to bankrupt Novus Energy and force a hostile takeover of my battery technology. They were using my family's greed as a weapon to destroy their biggest competitor. Knowing the truth and proving it were 2 different things. We needed concrete proof that my parents did not have the money to send me back in 2012. We tried to request the bank records from their local branch in Ohio, but we hit a wall of bureaucracy. The bank had been acquired by a larger national chain 5 years ago, and the old records were archived in a warehouse that required a subpoena and a 30-day waiting period to access. We did not have 30 days. We had days. Just as the hopelessness began to settle in again, my personal cell phone rang. It was an unknown number with an Ohio area code. I hesitated, then answered. The voice on the other end was raspy and hesitant. It was a woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Higgins. I remembered her instantly. She had worked the register at my parents' store for 20 years. She told me she had seen the news reports and the interviews where my parents cried about their sacrifice. She said she could not sleep knowing what they were doing to me. Mrs. Higgins told me that in 2012, the store was not making a profit. In fact, she remembered my father panic selling inventory just to keep the lights on. She told me she had kept a box of old shift schedules and daily sales sheets in her attic because she never trusted my father to pay her fairly. She promised that those papers would prove the store was bleeding money the very month I supposedly received my fortune. The courtroom air was thick and stagnant, smelling of floor wax and the nervous sweat of 100 reporters packed into the gallery. It felt less like a hall of justice and more like a Roman Colosseum where the lions were already circling. When the bailiff announced the entry of the plaintiffs, I watched my parents shuffle in. It was a performance worthy of an Academy Award. My mother, Mary, wore a faded floral dress that was 2 sizes too big, making her look frail and shrunken. My father, Roger, leaned heavily on a wooden cane I had never seen him use a day in his life. They looked like the very picture of destitute, heartbroken elderly parents, a stark contrast to the healthy, spiteful people who had screamed at me over the phone just weeks ago. Silas Blackwood wasted no time in capitalizing on this visual. He stood before the jury, his voice dripping with righteous indignation. He did not talk about contracts or statutes. He talked about the Bible. He talked about the sacred bond of family and the sacrifices parents make for their ungrateful children. He painted a picture of a couple who had starved themselves to feed a genius child, only to be discarded like trash once she found fame. The jury, mostly working-class citizens from the suburbs, looked from his theatrical gestures to my tailored suit, and I could see their sympathy shifting like the tide. Then came the lies. My father took the stand, his hand shaking as he took the oath. He looked at me with tear-filled eyes that seemed so genuine I almost doubted my own memory. He told the court that on the morning I left, he had not kicked me out. Instead, he claimed he had secretly sold the family home to a private buyer for $100,000 in cash to fund my dream. He described handing me the money in a brown paper grocery bag, telling me to go make them proud. It was a lie so bold and grotesque it took my breath away. They still lived in that house. I knew they did, but without the property records immediately available to refute him. His tears filled the gap where the evidence should have been. To make matters worse, Blackwood called 2 character witnesses. They were our old neighbors, the Millers. I remembered them as bitter people who spent their days gossiping on their porch. They took the stand and swore under oath that they had seen me leaving the house that morning clutching a heavy bag, looking guilty. They were not doing this for money. They were doing it because they hated that the girl from the poor side of town had become a CEO while they were still stuck in the same rut. Their jealousy gave their lies a terrifying conviction. I sat at the defense table, my body rigid, underneath the polished mahogany surface. My hands were gripping my knees so hard that my knuckles had turned bone white. I wanted to stand up and scream that they were liars, but I knew an outburst was exactly what Blackwood wanted. I had to be the ice to their fire. Sarah Jenkins, my lawyer, tried to fight back. She raised objections to the hearsay and the lack of physical documentation for this alleged house sale. But Judge Harrison was a problem. He was an old-school conservative who clearly despised what I represented. Every time Sarah pressed my father on the details, Judge Harrison sustained Blackwood's objections, scolding Sarah for badgering a fragile old man. He looked at me over his spectacles with thinly veiled disdain, as if I were a petulant child who needed a timeout. By the time the gavel banged to end the session, the damage was catastrophic. I checked my tablet as we packed up. The headlines were already live. Tech Queen or Family Fraud asked one major outlet, another read. The heartbreaking betrayal of the Vance family. The court of public opinion had already reached a verdict, and I was guilty. The walk to the waiting car was a gauntlet. Security tried to clear a path, but the crowd pressed in against the barricades. They were not cheering for the innovator of green energy anymore. They were screaming insults. I kept my head high and my eyes forward, but I flinched when something wet and heavy struck my shoulder. A raw egg shattered against my dark blazer, the yellow yolk sliding down my sleeve. A crumpled coffee cup followed, bouncing off the window as the door slammed shut. I sank into the leather seat, wiping the egg from my arm, and looked out at the distorted faces screaming through the glass. I had never felt more successful, and I had never felt more completely alone. The red neon sign of the motel buzzed outside my window. casting a rhythmic, bloody light across the cheap bedspread where I sat. It was past 2 a.m. when my phone vibrated against the nightstand. It was Lucas. I almost let it go to voicemail, but a lingering instinct, perhaps the last thread of sisterhood I had left, made me answer. His voice was a jagged mess of sobs and hyperventilation. He was not calling to apologize. He was calling because the sharks were circling. He told me that the men he owed money to were parked outside his apartment, and he was terrified to turn off the lights. He needed $5,000 immediately to buy another week of safety. When I told him that my assets were frozen and I could not access a single dime, his panic turned into rage. In his desperation, the truth finally slipped out. He screamed that Mom and Dad had promised him 30% of the settlement money. He said they had sworn that once they destroyed me in court, he would have enough to pay off his debts and live like a king. I pressed the record button on my phone with a trembling finger, hoping to capture that admission. But Lucas was too far gone. He was rambling incoherently, mixing threats with pleas for help, his words slurring together in a stream of drug-induced hysteria. When I played it back later, it was just a wall of noise and weeping. No judge would accept it as evidence. It was just the sound of a man drowning in his own choices. As I sat there listening to the dial tone after he hung up, an email notification chimed on my laptop. It was the report from the private investigator regarding the finances of Silas Blackwood. I opened the attachment, and the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with a sickening precision. The anonymous trust funding Blackwood was not a charity. The money trail led through a maze of shell companies in the Cayman Islands, but the investigator had found the terminal point. The bills were being paid by a subsidiary wholly owned by Fossil Corp. The nausea hit me hard. I ran to the small bathroom and splashed cold water on my face, staring at the dark circles under my eyes in the mirror. It all made perfect, terrible sense. Fossil Corp knew they could not beat my battery technology in the open market. My product was cheaper, cleaner, and more efficient, so they had decided to destroy the creator instead. They needed Novus Energy to go bankrupt so they could swoop in and buy my patents for pennies on the dollar during the liquidation. And they had found the perfect weapon to execute this assassination. They had rented my parents. I felt a profound sense of hollowness opening up inside my chest. It was one thing to know your parents were selfish. It was another entirely to realize they were mercenaries. They had not just sued me for money, they had actively conspired with my enemies to dismantle my life's work. They were willing to burn down the future of clean energy just to settle a gambling debt and satisfy their own petty grievances. It was a level of moral rot that I could barely comprehend. Sarah called me 10 minutes later. She sounded exhausted. She told me that the board of directors was pressuring us to settle. She suggested we offer them $5 million to drop the suit and sign a non-disclosure agreement. She said it would stop the bleeding and save the stock price. I listened to her logic, but my eyes were fixed on the water dripping from the bathroom faucet. I told Sarah no. There would be no settlement. There would be no negotiation with terrorists, especially when they shared my DNA. If I paid them, I would be validating their lie. I would be admitting that I owed them something. I hung up the phone before she could argue further. I was done being the victim. I pulled the box of old financial records that Mrs. Higgins had sent me onto the bed. Somewhere in this pile of yellowing paper was the truth. I spent the rest of the night cross-referencing dates and bank statements, looking for the one contradiction that could bring the whole structure down. I was not just preparing a defense anymore. I was building a trap. The second day of the trial began with a suffocating tension that made the air in the courtroom feel thin. My mother, Mary, took the stand. If my father's performance had been about stoic suffering, hers was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. She sat there with the tissue clutched in her hand, describing the agony of a mother whose child had vanished. She told the jury that she had spent nights sitting by the phone, praying I would call, leaving messages that went unanswered. It was a sick inversion of the truth. I remembered clearly the night I left, her voice screaming that if I walked out, I was never to contact them again. But the jury did not know that. They only saw a weeping old woman and a cold, successful CEO. My lawyer, Sarah, stood up to cross-examine. She went straight for the jugular. She introduced documents showing Lucas's staggering debts. She asked my mother if the lawsuit was really about justice, or if it was a desperate bid to save their son from loan sharks who were threatening to break his legs. For a moment, Mary's mask slipped and panic flitted across her eyes. But Silas Blackwood was on his feet in an instant. He roared an objection, claiming that Lucas's personal struggles were irrelevant to the theft of intellectual property and were being used solely to smear the character of the plaintiffs. Judge Harrison, true to form, sustained the objection immediately. He lectured Sarah on sticking to the facts of the case, effectively barring us from exposing the true motive behind the extortion. Then came the hammer blow. Blackwood approached the bench with a smug confidence that made my stomach turn. He presented a new piece of evidence, a document titled Promissory Note. It was a typed piece of paper dated the week I left, stating that I acknowledged a debt of $100,000 to my parents for business startup costs. At the bottom was my signature. I stared at the screen where the evidence was projected. My heart hammered against my ribs. I had never signed such a document. I had never even seen it before. But then I looked closer at the signature. The loop on the capital E was distinctive, a flourish I had used in high school but abandoned years ago. I realized with a jolt of horror where it came from. It was a direct copy of my signature from my 10th grade report card, the one I'd been so proud of because I got straight A's. They had scanned it, lifted it, and pasted it onto this fabrication. Blackwood called a handwriting expert to the stand. The man, wearing a suit that cost more than my parents' house, testified that he had analyzed the signature against known samples. He declared to the court that there was a 99% probability that the signature was authentic. The courtroom murmured. I looked over at the plaintiff's table. Silas Blackwood was looking right at me, a small, triumphant smile playing on his lips. He knew it was fake, and he knew that I knew, but he also knew that in a court of law, the truth matters less than what you can prove. My confidence shattered. I looked at the jury and saw their expressions harden. To them, I was no longer just an ungrateful daughter. I was a liar who had reneged on a written contract. Judge Harrison peered over his glasses, his face stern. He announced that the court would take a recess to review the admissibility of this new document. As he banged the gavel, I felt the walls closing in. If that note was admitted into evidence, the case was over. I would lose Novus Energy, my reputation would be destroyed, and the people who had abused me would walk away with everything I had built. The 45-minute recess felt less like a reprieve and more like the final countdown before an execution. I was pacing the small and windowless conference room allocated to the defense when there was a frantic knock at the door. Sarah opened it to reveal Mrs. Higgins, the former cashier from my parents' store. She looked exhausted, clutching a heavy, water-stained cardboard box against her chest. She had driven through the night from Ohio to Seattle to deliver the only thing she could salvage from the old storage unit before the new owners cleared it out. We dumped the contents of the box onto the table. The air instantly filled with the smell of mildew and dust. It was a chaotic mess of receipts, invoices, and shift schedules spanning 20 years. Sarah and her two paralegals dove into the pile, tossing aside irrelevant papers in a desperate search for anything dated from the year I left. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second hammering against my nerves. We had 20 minutes left before court reconvened. 10 minutes passed with nothing but useless invoices for produce and cigarettes. Then, I heard a sharp intake of breath from Sarah. She was holding a stack of papers stapled together, the edges curled and yellowed. It was a copy of a federal tax return and a legal petition filed in October of 2012. I leaned over her shoulder, scanning the dense legal jargon, and my blood ran cold. It was a filing for Chapter 13 bankruptcy. The documents were damning. In the sworn financial statement dated October 12th, 2012, just 3 days before I supposedly received a fortune from them, my parents had declared under penalty of perjury that they had less than $500 in total assets and were drowning in debt. They had not sold the house to a private buyer for cash, as my father had claimed on the stand. They had entered into a restructuring plan to stop the bank from foreclosing on it. If they had possessed $100,000 in cash, concealing it during a bankruptcy filing would have been a federal crime. More importantly, It proved that the cash never existed. "You cannot give away what you do not have. We had the smoking gun, but the trigger was jammed." Sarah immediately tried to verify the filing number on the Northern District of Ohio Bankruptcy Court website to get a certified digital copy that would be admissible in court. She clicked the search button, but the screen simply spun before displaying a fatal error message. The system was down for scheduled maintenance and would not be back online until tomorrow morning. We sat in stunned silence. Without the certified stamp from the court, this paper was just a photocopy. It was hearsay. If we tried to introduce it, Silas Blackwood would object that it could be a forgery, just like he claimed our evidence was. Judge Harrison, who had already shown his bias, would likely throw it out without a second thought. We had the truth in our hands, but legally, it was worthless until the server came back online. The bailiff knocked on the door, announcing that the judge was returning to the bench. Sarah looked at me with panic in her eyes. She said we should ask for a continuance, but we both knew Harrison would deny it. He wanted this trial over. I looked at the bankruptcy filing one last time, memorizing the dates and the specific case number. I realized I did not need the piece of paper to be admissible evidence right this second. I just needed my father to admit the truth. I stood up and smoothed my skirt. I told Sarah that I would conduct the cross-examination myself. She argued that it was too dangerous, that Blackwood would tear me apart, but I shook my head. A lawyer asks questions based on law. A daughter asks questions based on memories. I knew exactly where the skeletons were buried because I had lived in the graveyard. I was going to gamble everything on my ability to lead him into a trap of his own making. I walked back into the courtroom with nothing but an uncertified piece of paper in my pocket and a plan that had to work. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom sealed us in for the afternoon session. Judge Harrison looked down from his bench with evident impatience, clearly expecting my lawyer to wrap up a losing battle. Instead, I stood up. My legs felt heavy, but my voice was steady as I requested permission to cross-examine the witness myself. A ripple of whispers moved through the gallery. Silas Blackwood smirked, leaning back in his chair. He likely thought this was the desperate flailing of a drowning woman, an emotional outburst that would seal his victory. The judge hesitated, staring at me over his spectacles, before finally nodding his assent. I walked toward the witness stand where my father sat. Roger Vance looked at me with an expression of practiced sorrow, the grieving father forced to confront his wayward child. I decided to give him exactly what he wanted. I started softly. I asked him about my childhood, about whether he loved me, and if he had wanted me to succeed when I left for Boston. It was the perfect setup. He relaxed instantly, launching into a rehearsed speech about parental devotion. He spoke of how painful it was to let me go, how they had sacrificed their own comfort to ensure I had a fighting chance. The jury ate it up. They saw a saint. I saw a man walking blindfolded toward a cliff. Once he was comfortable, basking in the sympathy of the room. I tightened the noose. I asked him to clarify the timeline of that specific day. I asked him if he remembered the exact moment he handed me the money. Roger straightened his tie, looking directly at the jury. He stated clearly that it was the morning of October 15th, 2012. He described the weather, the look on my face, and the weight of the paper bag. I pressed him on the source of the cash. I asked if he had kept that amount of money under his mattress. He scoffed, shaking his head. He testified that he was a responsible man. He claimed he had gone to his bank, First National, right when the doors opened at 9 o'clock that morning. He said he withdrew his entire life savings, every penny he had managed to scrape together from selling the house, to give to me. It was a compelling story. It was detailed, emotional, and completely fabricated. I walked back to the defense table and picked up the yellow document Mrs. Higgins had brought. I held it up, not for the jury, but for him. I approached the bench and offered the paper to the judge, stating that I wished to submit a bankruptcy petition filed by Roger and Mary Vance into evidence. Silas Blackwood shot out of his chair as if he had been electrocuted. He shouted his objection, citing that the document was an uncertified photocopy, lacked a seal, and had not been disclosed during discovery. He argued furiously that it was inadmissible hearsay and likely a forgery intended to confuse the jury. The courtroom held its breath. Judge Harrison took the paper. He put on his reading glasses. As he scanned the lines, the impatience on his face was replaced by a deep, furrowed frown. He looked from the paper to my father and then to Silas. The air in the room shifted. It was no longer the stale atmosphere of a routine trial. It was the electric charge before a storm. Silas Blackwood was no longer smirking. Beads of sweat had broken out on his forehead. He was making frantic, subtle hand gestures to my father, trying to signal him to stop talking. But Roger was too deep in his performance. He did not see his lawyer's panic. He turned to the judge, his voice trembling with righteous indignation, and insisted that he had given me everything, that he had left himself with nothing just to see me fly. I turned my back on my father and looked up at the judge. I saw the doubt in his eyes. He knew the paper wasn't technically admissible yet, but he also knew that what he was reading contradicted everything he had just heard. I asked quietly if the court would allow me one final question to clarify the timeline and the credibility of the witness. The judge looked at the uncertified document in his hand, then at the confident liar on the stand, and finally at me. He nodded. Judge Harrison lowered the document, and the silence in the room was so absolute that I could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. He did not look at the uncertified stamp or the lack of a seal. He looked at the dates. He picked up his gavel and struck the block once, a sharp crack that made my father jump in the witness chair. The judge leaned forward, clasping his hands together, and fixed his eyes directly on Roger Vance. "Mr. Vance," the judge began, his voice dangerously calm. "You testified under oath just 5 minutes ago that you withdrew $100,000 in cash from your savings account at First National Bank on the morning of October 15th, 2012. My father nodded vigorously, trying to maintain his charade. "Yes, Your Honor." "That is the absolute truth." Judge Harrison held up the bankruptcy petition. "Then can you explain to this court why your federal Chapter 13 filing states clearly that First National Bank seized and froze that exact account for non-payment on October 12th, 3 days before you supposedly withdrew the money?" "The air left the room." My father's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish thrown onto dry land, gasping for oxygen that was not there. The color drained from his face so fast it looked like he was about to faint. He stammered, looking wildly toward Silas Blackwood for help, but his lawyer was already done. Blackwood had his head down and was shoving papers into his briefcase, trying to distance himself from the blast radius. The silence that stretched between the bench and the witness stand was the loudest confession I had ever heard. Everyone in the room, from the jury to the reporters in the back row, understood what had happened. It was a mathematical impossibility. You cannot withdraw money from a frozen account, and the lie had collapsed under its own weight. Judge Harrison did not wait for an answer. He threw the paper down and declared that the testimony of the plaintiff was visibly perjured and the evidence submitted was fraudulent. He dismissed the case with prejudice, meaning they could never sue me again. But he was not finished. He signaled to the bailiff standing by the door. I watched as the uniformed officers marched forward. My mother started to wail, a shrill sound of genuine terror as they pulled Roger from the stand. The judge ordered them taken into custody immediately for perjury and attempting to defraud the court. The click of the handcuffs was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. I stood up and looked at them one last time. They were crying and begging, shouting my name, asking me to help them. But I saw no remorse in their eyes. I only saw the panic of predators who had finally been caught. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, a burden I had been carrying for 12 years, simply evaporating into the ether. I turned my back on them. I walked down the center aisle of the courtroom, past the stunned reporters and the gaping jury. I pushed open the heavy double doors and stepped out onto the courthouse steps. The rain had stopped, and the late afternoon sun was breaking through the gray clouds, bathing the city in golden light. I did not look back at the building. I did not look back at my past. When I returned to the headquarters of Novus Energy, the lobby was full. My employees were standing on the balconies and the stairs. As I walked in, they erupted into applause. It was not polite clapping. It was a roar of support. I checked the monitors on the wall. The news of the verdict had hit the wire. The stock price of Novus Energy was vertical, erasing the losses of the week and climbing to a new all-time high. That evening, I sat in my office and signed one final document. It was not a lawsuit or a settlement. It was the charter for the Vance Foundation. I was establishing a full scholarship fund for students who had been estranged from their families or kicked out of their homes. I was going to use my money to make sure that the next kid walking through a snowstorm with a backpack had somewhere to go. I put the pen down and looked out at the city lights. The war was over. I had won, and the future belonged entirely to me. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please leave a comment below, sharing your location and your thoughts on Elena's journey. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the Mira Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that hype button to help this story reach even more listeners.